Alright, I've already taken the liberty of taking this mount bracket off from here. One of the transfer case bolts resides under here and you can't get to it otherwise. So I start by removing this 30mm 12-point nut. Just as a note, this stuff is kind of loose because I took this apart, cleaned it, etc. first. So we have our nut, our output flange. Next, we're going to take out this 8mm Allen head bolt. If you notice, it has an angled washer on it. Next, we're going to remove these T-45 bolts. Next, we're going to tap this apart. Rubber mallet, please. As you see, there's a transfer gear in here. There's a bearing retained in here. There's a bearing race. But this really isn't anything you have to do too much with. So now we're down to the business end of this. Next, I'm going to mark these gears. This one's obvious, but we want to be able to put them back in the right direction, obviously. Now, we have an O-ring here, which needs to be removed. And as a side note on these things, people often ask me where you get the O-rings, and my best answer is just matching it up, an O-ring assortment. It's not something that's readily available, but it's not, you know, not any kind of witchcraft or anything either. These are kind of easily obtainable. Next, we're going to remove this oil splash shield. There are 3 T30 Torx fasteners. We have to remove these 2 10mm Allens. This also has a special washer on it. As does this one. At that point, we could remove the gears. I like to start with this one. And that sound was the sound of a shim that you need to be aware of. And there's also 2 more in this particular one. The amount may vary. These go on your output shaft. It's perfectly alright to leave them there, but just don't lose them or anything like that. Next, we could take out this middle gear, and we have 2 cone bearings with a spacer in between them. This spacer serves to set your bearing crush. Finally, we have this last gear, and they can be a little stubborn to get out. If you pry on it, you don't want to pry against the gasket surface. It's not quite as hard as it looks, but I'm trying to stand off to the side so you can see. Finally, there's another shim here that you need to be aware of. With that all done, there's still some bolts that remain, as well as a little additional oil shield, which really shouldn't go anywhere, but you don't want to forget it either. You're also going to notice that there's no gaskets on here, but again, this was set up to be nice and clean so you could get a good view of everything. And finally, there's a 17mm cooler line fitting that you're going to have to move. At this point, we make sure all the bolts are out, and now we could tap off this next layer. So we're down to everything that we need here. Another thing to be aware of is this spacer that goes here and engages into here. Again, these are O-rings that you could change if you like, or a little silicone is fine. This is not pressure or anything like this. It's just for oil spilling back, so they usually seal just fine. Okay, so this is kind of self-explanatory. These bolts go with the shield. You have long bolts and you have short bolts. The long bolts are the ones that go through both pieces of the housing, and the short ones are sporadically spread apart. But all of the ones that bolted to the case are of the short variety. So the reason that you're probably watching this is because your gaskets are leaking. So we sell the replacement gaskets. They engage on these dowel pins, presumably. So this piece will go onto here. You have to line it up. Your pinion shaft is going to kind of push through it. And just a couple taps by hand are usually all it takes to seat it. Now we could go ahead and put some of our short bolts in. These have some factory Loctite on them, but you could also put blue Loctite yourself if you feel more comfortable doing that. Okay, so this is just 5 bolts here. So now the first step is to tighten these. Before anybody complains in the comments about impact guns, etc., we just take them down so they're snug, and we use a torque wrench, which I recommend for almost everything on an automatic transmission. There's no published specs for this, so just based on bolt size and my own experience, I go 22 foot-pounds of torque on these. There's not a specific torque sequence, but you just use your head and work from the inside out. Like I just didn't do. So now that's your first layer. All right, so next, they call it superstition, but I kind of like to let these sit for a little while and then torque them again. So remember to put your little oil slinger in here. That's what it looks like when it's seated correctly. Ensure that your shim is present here. And we're going to see if we can get another little snug on these, which we can. Next, we're going to put our pinion gear back on. Have to kind of line up the splines. And this one is a bit of a pain because it has to simultaneously engage this roller bearing and these splines, and it's sometimes not exact, and it needs a little bit of a tap to get in there. Next, we put our cone bearing on. Our selective spacer, which you will not have to mess with if you're not changing parts. Our gaskets are made to the exact size as the factory ones. As a side note, some guys take these apart and put them together with silicone, but that is not going to work. You have several sets of cone bearings in here, and if you don't use gaskets, you use silicone, you're going to remove the distance of the gasket. So what you end up with is you're going to have about 12 thousandths of additional bearing crush, which you're not going to be happy about because it's going to blow up this very expensive transmission very quickly. Next is this output gear of the transmission. Again, whatever shims you had, you want to make sure those are all present and accounted for. We just have to twist a little bit to engage the splines. Everything looks like it's in place. Now I've put in Loctite on these bolts, and we're going to put them back in. I typically go to 50 foot-pounds with them. Now you're going to want to make sure this is in park so it's not turning on you. Now we're going to put our cover back on, or our oil slinger rather. And this, you do what you like, but I don't really bother torquing these. So now this is all in place. Now we can put our other gasket on. Sometimes they're a little unruly. You can hold it with a dab of grease or some sealant, but I kind of prefer not to do it that way. This piece we're just going to engage on here, and it won't go until it's right. We'll know. Now you're going to put in your long bolts and short bolts, and that's fairly obvious as well. Some of them just go through the one layer, while some go through both. Right, I spared you the obvious. The bolts are all in place, and we're going to try and torque them in an even pattern. Again, let them sit and torque them again. Your output shaft flange. A little Loctite on the nut. And you could probably get a new one if you want. I don't know if Porsche sells them, but I'd assume this is interchangeable with the Chrysler and Mercedes versions. This goes to 120 foot-pounds. Additionally, there's a little spot in which you can stake this nut down to lock it. Lastly, this Allen head bolt. Once again, the torque specs will be in the description, but this one we're going to go to 38 foot-pounds. What I like to do is take it out of park after this, make sure everything turns freely. If it doesn't, take it back apart because something's very wrong. Other than that, we have to replace our little mount bracket here. What's also something to note, I hear this from my customers, I don't necessarily work on these cars, I just work on the transmissions, but this leak, so I'm told, is often a result of this mount going bad. It allows for flexation and this gasket kind of breaks and squeezes out. Lastly, our cooler line. 17 millimeter. And we're done.